Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the committee's 9th meeting in 2021. Could I just ask everyone, please, to make sure that their phones are on silent, and just to say that the meeting will be conducted in virtual format. The first item on the agenda is an evidence session on transport, and I'd like to welcome to the committee Michael Matheson, the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Infrastructure and Connectivity, Bill Reevey, the Director of Rail, Alison Irvine, the Director of Transport Strategy and Analysis, and Joe Blewett, the Head of Design Team, Scottish Government. Now, before we go into the questions and the Cabinet Secretary, you make your brief opening statement, I'd like to see if there are any declarations from members. I think, Stuart Stevenson, you may have a declaration of interest.
Thank you, Convener. I draw attention to my register of interest, which shows I'm the Honorary President of the Scottish Association for Public Transport and Honorary Vice President for Rail Future UK. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And now I'm going to come to the Cabinet Secretary to make a brief opening statement. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Committee. In this parliamentary session, this government has made significant progress across all areas of transport. Firstly, this government has shown a strong commitment to the long-term future of transport. We published a National Transport Strategy in February 2020 to set out a compelling vision for Scotland's transport system over the next 20 years. Through the Transport Act, we introduced Scotland's first major piece of transport legislation in 14 years. And in our recently published Climate Change Plan update, we set out Scotland's pathway to 2032 for reaching net zero by 2045 and achieving a green recovery from the pandemic that is just and fair. The COVID pandemic has had a significant impact on the way that people travel and on public transport operators. That's why the Scottish Government has committed to some £765 million of additional support for transport operators. We know that challenges lie ahead, but our transport transition plan continues to evolve and officials continue to work to ensure that we meet the needs of the country and keep Scotland moving. The Scottish Government has delivered major transport infrastructure projects across Scotland. The AWPR has delivered much welcomed improvements to journey times for local road users in the North East and cut HGV traffic along the A82 corridor through Aberdeen. The Edinburgh to Glasgow Improvement Programme has delivered a journey time of 42 minutes between the cities, and we have opened stations in communities such as Rob Royston and Kintore. And we're already investing a record £100.5 million per annum in active travel, which we assured for the next 5 years in the programme for government. However, next year, this funding will increase to £115.5 million. Our Strategic Transport Projects Review has already made recommendations for Phase 1 and will report later this year, setting out a future transport investment plan for the next 20 years. To finish, I want to touch on the Union Connectivity Review, which was published today by the UK Government. Decisions on transport is a devolved matter, and the Union Connectivity Review was established without any discussion and consultation with the Scottish Government. We'll always seek to engage constructively with the UK Government, but never in a way that undermines the devolved settlement. In Scotland, we have robust processes for identifying our investment priorities. These processes are not undertaken in isolation and are in place to allow assessment of spending priorities across government. You're fully aware of this, and I come here to face scrutiny on those processes, priorities and decisions on a regular basis. And we're already evidencing future transport investment in Scotland through the STPR2 process, not the Union Connectivity Review. What Scotland really needs now is an infrastructure-led economic recovery to deliver new jobs and to speed up the transition to net zero, which, with the 5% cut to our capital budget by the UK Spending Review for 2021-2022, becomes more difficult. And on that note, Convener, I'm happy to respond to questions from the committee.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, and there are quite a lot of questions, which I'm sure members will keep short to allow you to answer in the same way. So, Colin Smith, you're the first one, and my Question before you start, Colin, is are you going to roll your rail questions up into one? It would seem logical. And if so, let's go with all of them together. Colin.
Okay, convener. I wasn't, but I'll do that. Thank you. As the convener says, I'll kick off with a question on rail, Cabinet Secretary, and good morning. Emergency measures agreements with Abellio and Serco for the ScotRail and Caledonia Sleeper services are due to expire at the end of this month. So can I ask, does Transport Scotland intend to continue EMAs from April onwards? And what is your estimated cost for that extra support to be paid to Abellio and Serco from the taxpayer?
Good morning. Yes, we are taking forward work to put in place a further EMA for both the Caledonia Sleeper and also for the ScotRail franchise. We intend to take those EMAs forward to the end of the franchise period in March 2022, and we're presently drawing that case together to put to the Finance Secretary. The final figures on that have still to be finalised at this stage. What we have is provided an estimate of around £452 million in additional support, which has already been provided since March of last year through to March of this year. And I would expect broadly a similar level of support being required for the remaining year through to March 2022. The slight challenge in being able to, or the significant challenge in being able to give you more specific figures around this is that one of the things that we do hope will happen later this year is that we'll start to see recovery and a return to the use of public transport at a level which is significantly higher than we've had over the last year. And therefore, there is a possibility of further revenue returns to be achieved. However, at this stage, it's difficult to predict what that will be, but the EMA will be designed on the basis that we need to continue to provide the financial support so that staff have got security of employment and also that travellers have got access to rail services.
Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned the estimated cost up until March this year, and I noticed that Transport Scotland eventually published figures last month that showed that between March and September 2020, they confirmed that the government paid Abellio and Serco £499.1 million, and that was obviously £231.5 million more than the franchise agreement for the first EMA up until September 2020. Can you confirm just how much of that extra was management fees to the two companies, and when will we know the cost and management fees for the EMA since September?
I don't have the figure specifically in front of me on management fees. I can ask Bill Reeve if he's able to provide you with that specific information. But the management fee for initial EMA was at a slightly higher level than that which was set out in EMA 2, and the provisions in EMA 3 are likely to be similar. But I can ask Bill Reeves if he's got the specific figure for you, Mr. Smith, if that would be helpful.
Bill. Good morning.
Good morning, convener. Good morning, Mr. Smith. I'm afraid I don't have that figure to hand. I will write with that figure, but I would confirm what the Cabinet Secretary said, that the figure for the second period is anticipated to be a little lower, and we're looking at appropriate, entirely performance-related incentives for any future agreement.
Thanks for that. Can I turn, I suppose, to the future and ask Cabinet Secretary what discussions you've had with the UK Government on future provision of rail services, and in particular the planned rail white paper?
So we've had officials have had engagement with colleagues at the Department for Transport, but as yet there is no clarity from the UK Government on the publication of their white paper. It's now over a year late. We've had a few false dawns on its possible publication. I heard a few weeks ago that it may be published at the beginning of March. We've moved into almost the middle of March, and it's still not been published. So I don't have clarity on exactly when it's now going to be published. However, prior to the white paper being drawn together, I engaged with Keith Williams, who was carrying out the Williams Review, directly on several occasions, setting out what I believe is important in Scotland for making sure that we have a more integrated rail system in Scotland that will improve services for passengers. And I know that these were factors that were taken into account in his report to the UK government. What we don't know yet is how that is now manifest within the white paper itself, and we won't know that until it's published. But I don't have any clarity as yet on its publication, I'm afraid.
So just on that, it does look like it may be that the new arrangements may not kick in time for March 2022 when the current Mobilio ScotRail franchise ends. So can you tell me very specifically what you intend to do in terms of the running of services from March 2022 if the new provisions haven't been put in place? Are you going to extend the Mobilio ScotRail franchise?
So in terms of what arrangements we'll put in place post-March 2022, it is to some degree subject to changes that may be afforded within the white paper. However, we are looking at several different options, and I intend to update Parliament before we go into recess on what approach we will take in March 2022. That to some degree is dependent upon what's in the white paper, but I certainly will be updating Parliament on what measures we'll be putting in place March 2022 before the recess period starts.
As Gavin said, you know, obviously my preferred option would be that we have a public sector organisation running the franchise from March 2022. So is that an option you're looking at, and are you absolutely ruling out any prospect of extending the Mobilio franchise from March 2022?
So, as I've said, I'm going to set out prior to the recess exactly what approach we're going to take post-March 2022. Not only do I believe that we should have a public sector controlled railway, I also think we have to have an integrated railway system so that there is a direct connection between the infrastructure arrangements and also that of passenger services. The franchise system is broken. I think that's now universally accepted. What we now need to do is have a system that allows us to see greater integration between the infrastructure and passenger services. And that's what we're looking for within the white paper. As it stands at the present moment, we don't have the legal powers to be able to affect that change in a way that I think can deliver better services for passengers and a more effective and efficient railway system in Scotland. But it is part of our planning and thinking should those powers become available to us. And I do hope, as I say, I do intend to set things out prior to the recess so that both members and in particular those who work on Scotland's railway have a clear understanding of what action the Scottish Government is going to take.
And can I just ask a final question? The Cabinet Secretary, the Scottish Government took a decision to break up the ScotRail franchise into two separate parts. So while we know that the Mobilio franchise ends in 2022, the Serco franchise for the Caledonia Sleeper runs until, as things stand, 2030. Can you confirm whether or not your plans that you'll outline in the future will also cover the Serco franchise? Because you say you're in favour of a public sector run railway, but frankly Serco is not public sector, and you currently have a commitment to run that until 2030. So will you also end that franchise and bring that under public control?
So my intentions are to set out the direction of travel for the ScotRail franchise post 2022. Decisions around the Serco franchise will be determined more by what's set out within the white paper. So, but the immediate action we'll be taking is around the ScotRail franchise rather than the Caledonian Sleeper franchise.
Thanks, Convener.
Thank you, Colin. Cabinet Secretary, just before we move on, could you just clarify something for me? You said the additional extra money was in the tune of about 450 million. So could you just confirm that actually means that the railways are costing, as part of the budget, between 1.3 and 1.4 billion pounds a year to run? Is that right, or have I got those figures wrong?
No, I think you may be correct, but I'll ask Bill Reeves if he's got that figure straight to hand in terms of the overall figure for operating rail services, because the 452 million pounds is additional support that's been provided to rail services, but I don't have the the overall figure in front of me, and I don't know if Bill has it there to hand.
I'm sure Bill will. Bill, can you just confirm that?
Okay. Convener, you're exactly right that the incremental figures are taking us up to that 1.3 to 1.4 billion level. The Cabinet Secretary is also correct in saying that the extent to which the level of additional subsidy needs to continue depends upon the rate at which passengers are able to return safely to the railway service. So in essence, the increment over our normal expenditure is to fill in the gap for the missing passenger revenue. And the sooner the revenue comes back, the lower the total level of support next year would expect to be. But of course, we don't yet know how quickly and to what level and at what rate that will occur.
But sorry, just while you, having made that comment, but in line with predictions, it will be a fairly slow increment, passenger increment at the last part of this year as we come out of lockdown. So the levels will probably remain roughly the same. It's not going to be a huge leap in fare income, is it?
Well, I think we saw over the summer of last year, we saw revenues moving back towards about the 30% level and continuing to increase until we started to move back into lockdown. I have no doubt there is an appetite for travel when it is safe to do so around our wonderful country. So I'm afraid my crystal ball is a little cloudy, but I'm cautiously optimistic that there will be a return, particularly for leisure and tourist travel, as soon as it is safe and legal to do so.
Thank you. Time will tell.
Convener, just on that point, I think Bill makes an important point here, is that some of the recovery we saw last year was largely around leisure travel rather than business travel. And what's uncertain going forward is not just the rate of recovery, is the nature of the recovery we see as well. So there is quite a level of uncertainty at the present moment. So the figures are provisional on the basis of that they could change quite markedly.
Okay, noted. Thank you. The next questions come from John Finney. John.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and your officials. Cabinet Secretary, I'd like to ask you, if I may, about bus, tram and subway services. Do you anticipate any further rounds of support for buses, trams and subway? And if so, what form will that support take and how much might be available, please?
Good morning. We provided additional funding of some £61.4 million, which I announced on Monday, to provide financial support to public bus operators. The nature of that funding is to bridge a gap between revenue lost as a result of having reduced passenger numbers and also having to maintain social distancing for operators, which has an impact on their fare box. So the funding which we've set is to bridge that gap while maintaining services. Overall, so far, as I mentioned in my opening comments, Mr Finney, we have provided some £765 million of support to rail, bus, light rail, and also to ferry operators since March of last year. I would anticipate the level of funding needed by bus operators post-June of this year, which is where the £61 million will take us up to, again is unclear because it depends on recovery and the level of return we see in passenger use and whether physical distancing, social distancing has to be maintained. I suspect on some of the light rail services, they will require further financial support as well, and we'll consider those on an individual basis, the way in which we have over the course of the last year. And I also anticipate that ferry services will require financial support as well. Although they are planning to be able to ramp up to a full summer timetable if necessary, they will still probably have to maintain a level of physical distancing, and on that basis it will have an impact on their revenue. So there will be a need for continued financial support, and I'll be submitting requests to our colleagues in finance to help to meet those requirements at appropriate times.
Okay, thanks for that, Cabinet Secretary. I appreciate there's a significant measure of uncertainty about
Yeah.
things going ahead. If I can stick with buses, please. The Scottish Government allocated £10 million for coronavirus-related pop-up bus infrastructure. That was in July of last year. Can you outline what has been installed using these funds and what impact it's had on bus travel, please?
So the £10 million was allocated to local authorities and their partners, and they've been taking that forward. The final details of the completion of that work is due to be completed by the end of this month. So by the end of March, we should have all of the returns from the local authorities. Some of them have been using them specifically for pop-up bus infrastructure, so temporary bus stops, closer to, for example, vaccination centres or closer to hospitals, etc. Some have also been using it to help to support some of the permanent bus infrastructure that they're putting in place, which we've agreed to. So there's a variety of different types of infrastructure that it's supporting, both temporary and, to some degree, some elements of permanent infrastructure. But the full outcome of that we expect to get from local authorities is at the end of this month, and I'd be more than happy to share that directly with the committee once we've had those returns from our colleagues in local authorities.
Okay, many thanks indeed. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, John. Maureen, I think you wanted to come in with a question on that. Maureen, what?
Yes, Cabinet Secretary, good morning. In relation to the pop-up bus infrastructure, I hope you will do a really good review of how the money was spent throughout local authorities on that, especially in Aberdeen, where bus stops were moved from the normal place and street furniture put in, now totally removed again. But it was so unnecessary because it meant that bus stops were not near where the real-time information was, and it was just complete and utter waste of time and a waste of a lot of money. So I think that whole thing needs to be reviewed, certainly in terms of Aberdeen City Council's use of money.
Cabinet Secretary.
Good morning. We'll certainly look at that specifically. I know that some local authorities have used some of the Spaces for People money alongside the bus infrastructure funding as well. So some of the streets and roads which have been closed off have been supported through the Spaces for People programme. But I'd be more than happy to take that away and look at the issue. And as I say, we're expecting feedback from all of the local authorities by the end of March.
And I also know in the case of Aberdeen, none of it was done in consultation with the bus companies.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Convener. Some food for thought there. Right, the next question from Stuart Stevenson, and I'd like to try and bring in Jamie Halcrow-Johnson after your first bit, Stuart. So, Stuart.
Thank you, Convener, and I see what Jamie's going to ask, so I won't tread on what he's going to ask. I've just got a very simple extension to what you've already said on Calmac ferries, and that is once the period of when do you expect to transfer from the winter timetable to the summer timetable, and will it be the usual summer timetable? You've already made comment about the carrying capacity be reduced, but will the frequency and destinations be the usual?
Good morning. You'll be aware, Mr Stevenson, last summer we operated what's termed a shoulder timetable, try and meet an increased level of demand, but obviously also understanding that the demand would not return to its normal levels due to the restrictions we still had during the summer of last year. This year, what we asked Calmac to do was to put in place arrangements so that if the restrictions are sufficiently eased for people to be able to travel again, that they would be able to step up to a full timetable. So they have taken forward planning on the basis that they will be able to recruit to operate a full timetable across the network this summer. However, capacity on that will be limited. The decision making on moving forward with that will be taken forward over the next couple of months when we can see the potential indications around travel restrictions starting to ease, but CalMac have put in place an arrangement so that they can step up to a full timetable this summer if necessary. And I believe that in April next month, I can't remember whether it's at the beginning of the month or later on in the month, where they will look to update the timetable booking system to allow people to then start booking for over the summer months. So there's so over the next couple of weeks we'll get a better idea, and then over the next couple of months CalMac will be able to operationalise their plans for summer, depending on what the travel restrictions may look like.
Okay, Jamie, I'm going to come to you and then come back to Stuart. Jamie Hancock-Johnson.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning to the Cabinet Secretary and to his team. Today's edition of the Orcadian highlights frustrations from Pentland Ferries that the much promised reduced ferry fares on the Pentland Firth route still haven't been delivered. These were promised in 2017 by Humza Yousaf, and he actually visited Orkney to make that promise, and delivery was planned by 2018. That deadline was missed, and at the time, Cabinet Secretary, you blamed this on state aid rules and the failure to agree a deal with the operators. Well, state aid rules for the EU no longer apply, and the legal challenge from Pentland Ferries has concluded. So could you advise me what the barriers are now to delivering the reduced ferry fares on those routes? And given that you've previously intimated to me that there's only partial funding for this being earmarked in the 2021-2022 budget, when that delivery on that commitment, delivery on that commitment is not kind of expected anytime soon, when you would be expecting to actually meet that promise to reduce fares on the Northern Isles routes, on the Pentland Firth routes?
Cabinet Secretary.
The member is right to say that there were legal challenges around the introduction of RET onto the Northern Isle routes, which were taken forward by Pentland Ferries, which has delayed progress with the matter. Given the present legal standing around their challenge and also the view of the European Commission in this matter, officials are presently working through the implications in moving forward with any changes to ferry fares for the Northern Isles route. So there's work ongoing at the present time on that. What I can't say to you at the present time is exactly the time frame for taking that forward, because there are still some issues that need to be resolved internally within the Transport Scotland around some legal aspects of it. But I can assure the member that we are taking forward the action that's necessary to try and resolve this matter and to try and address it when we can. But equally, the member will also welcome the significant additional funding that we allocated in our budget yesterday to support the Northern Isles councils on helping to meet the costs which they're facing for local ferry services, which I've no doubt will be welcomed by your constituents in Orkney and in Shetland, given that that's been a long-standing issue for them.
Can I come back very quickly, Convener? I mean, yes, I do, because we've been campaigning for this for many, many years, and my concern, Cabinet Secretary, is that we're going to have to wait as long for this promise to be delivered as we were for the ones funding the internal ferries. And then it does seem to be that my constituents in Orkney, and I'm from Orkney and I recognise the importance of these routes, have been promised something that we are still 4 years later waiting for. So while I welcome that there are this is still a live issue that's being worked through, I don't have a huge amount of confidence, and I don't think a lot of people in Orkney have confidence that the Scottish Government is likely to resolve this anytime soon.
That sounds like us. Hold on, sorry, Cabinet Secretary, just 2 seconds, if I may. I just caution everyone, it's questions I like, not statements. And that goes for everyone. I know there's something coming up in a couple of months' time, but we're here to question. So, Cabinet Secretary, I'm very happy if you want to make a statement, but I'm not really good on making political points. Questions we want and answers.
I'll just respond to the statement, Convener, and that is, I'm disappointed that the member feels that way, because you'll be aware that we put in discount schemes in order to try and help to address the challenges which we face because of the legal challenge. But I do welcome the fact that he has acknowledged and welcomed the additional funding we provided for local ferry services in the Northern Isles, although I am disappointed that he chose to vote against the budget that would provide that.
Cabinet Secretary, you couldn't help yourself, but you're not going to get away with it again. Stuart Stevenson, could you come in with your questions?
Thank you, Convener. I don't think we travel into similar murky water here. I just want to explore, and I'm going to consolidate my questions into one. The issue of reduced use of public transport is associated with the reduced travel altogether, and we don't know what travel patterns or travel modes will look like post-coronavirus. So how are the government and Transport Scotland going to make sure, to the extent that we can, that we don't simply see people who may be using cars at the moment in substitution for public transport journeys continue to do that? And just to roll up the other aspect of all this, we're very keen, all of us, to see active travel encouraged. And can you say anything about the active freeways proposals and a timetable for implementation for that?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think you raise a number of very important issues and also significant challenge that we face coming out of the pandemic. I think there is a danger that what happens is that some of the habits which have been formed by people making use of their private car during the course of the pandemic becomes a lasting legacy once the pandemic ends. There's a number of factors which are important here. One is to reassure the public that it is safe to use public transport, and it's safe to use public transport at the present time. However, you should only be travelling if it is absolutely essential, and you should follow the guidance around how you should use face covering and keep socially distanced, etc. What will be important, and we've engaged with transport providers on this, is how we can help to incentivise people to move back to public transport once we get to the point when we can encourage people to move back into using public transport. So, for example, are there more attractive ticketing regimes, discount schemes that could be offered to incentivise people back into the use of our rail network? And that's work that has been taken forward by ScotRail and looking at various options, and I know that some of the bus operators are doing the same. Secondly, we need to make sure that we help to support people who have chosen to make greater use of active travel during the course of the pandemic. So the ramping up of our funding for active travel and also providing that long-term security of a 5-year investment programme is to help to support our colleagues in local government and in other sectors who invest in active travel to be able to put that infrastructure in place and to do so in a way that helps to support people continuing to use active travel. And the third area, which I think is really important, particularly when it comes to bus, is the need to make sure that we increase the prioritisation of bus in our road space. So with dedicated bus routes, bus priority lighting at junctions, all of which can help to improve journey times and make using buses much more attractive. And that's why we're providing such a significant amount of money, over £500 million in the next 5 years through the Bus Partnership Fund. So there's a variety of things that we can do, some things we can do in the short term, and there are other actions we can take forward in the medium to long term to encourage people back into public transport and also to encourage more people to make use of public transport in the future. Finally, Convener, on the issue of active freeways, the £50 million we've allocated for those, they're a concept which is about looking at providing active travel links to major, it could be major cultural settings or links between towns in order to support the ability to commute between towns or in accessing major tourism events, major tourist events. And part of the work that we're taking forward just now with partners in local government is to work with them and looking at trying to identify some of those options and how they can be developed and progressed in the next couple of years.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Do you share my frustration at the way in which the costs of different alternatives for travel are presented. For example, the fully amortised cost of using my little Honda Civic to travel from Banffshire to Edinburgh is approximately 50% higher than the total costs of travelling by train, even without a senior rail card. And yet people think otherwise. And similarly, when you see comparisons between flying to London and getting the train to London, the airfares are often ones that are bought 3 weeks in advance to get discounts, and the rail fares are the walk-up fares. And I wonder, what role could the government play in helping us understand the relative economics of different travel modes, and perhaps to encourage us even more, when can you get catering back on trains? Because that's something you definitely can't do in your car, and it makes the journey such a more pleasant experience, I have to say. That's it, Convener, once I hear the answer to this.
Cabinet Secretary, are you going to have to provide coffee to get Stuart back on the train? But seriously, answer the question.
I get the message, Convener. So, but you'll be aware of the reasons why there's no catering at the present time, and I of course it will be reintroduced as early as possible. And I appreciate, particularly for the Convener and yourself, Mr. Stevenson, who have fairly long rail journeys returning back to the north of the northeast of Scotland. So look, on your wider point around what we can do, you know, very often it's not comparing apples with apples when it comes to comparable prices. So the cost of you running your Honda Civic from your home to Parliament isn't just the fuel costs, but it's all the associated wear and tear costs and road tax costs which are associated with that journey as well, which are very often not presented in the actual comparable cost with rail. And it's the same for some aspects of aviation as well. Some of the costs which are associated with aviation are for getting taxis to the airport, etc., parking up at the airport and leaving your vehicle there, etc. All of these things are not often factored in. So you're right. I think there is a need for us to have comparative data that is more accurate in reflecting that. And I think that's a good point, which I'd be more than happy to take away, and to think if there's something that we as a government can do that gives a more accurate comparison between different modes of transport and the true costs associated with them.
I'm sure I should probably say at this stage there are other vehicles than the one that's been mentioned, but probably that goes without saying. The next questions come from Emma Harper. Emma.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. A couple of questions around the National Transport Strategy. I know a lot of work has been done for the National Transport Strategy and the Strategic Transport Projects Review. And in your opening, you talked a little bit about the Union Connectivity Review, and I have concerns with that because obviously there are issues that a lot of hard work has been put into place already for the Strategic Transport Projects Review. And obviously I have got big issues in my area with the 75, 76 and 77 needing investment, and the Cabinet Secretary has heard me bleat on about this for a long time. But I'm concerned about the Union Connectivity Review and how that will, does that detract from the work that's already taken place with the Strategic Projects Review?
Good morning, and I recognise this has been an issue which has been raised with me by Emma Harper on a number of occasions. The National Transport Strategy is critical in helping to shape our transport priorities for the next 10 to 20 years, and the process of determining what those priorities would be. And we've set out within our NTS the transport hierarchy, which is also reflected in our investment hierarchy, where issues such as active travel, etc., new roads are within that structure. The STPR2 process is the strategic process that we use for determining the transport investment priorities within a given area. So within your own constituency area in the southwest of Scotland, you'll be aware of the Southwest Scotland Transport Corridor Study, which has identified, I think if I recall correctly, about 23 different interventions that should be considered for investment within the southwest of Scotland to improve connectivity. That covers all modes, so through active travel, through to rail and through to road investment. And within that identifies, for example, some of the key roads that you've mentioned, for example, the A77, the A76 and the A75. And even on these roads, identifies the areas where those priority investments should actually be, whether it be bypasses or whether it be road realignment. So a very significant level of work has already been undertaken around the appraisal process for the southwest of Scotland, including the A75, in identifying what is required and the nature of the changes that need to be made to the road. The problem with the Union Connectivity Review, put the politics of it aside, is that it's a very shallow process. So there was something like 100 individuals that made representations to the Union Connectivity Review across the whole of the UK. The South West Scotland Transport Corridor Study engaged almost, I think, 2,500 people locally in order to, and stakeholders, to identify what their priorities would be. And I'll be perfectly frank with you, Convener and other members of the committee. The discussion I had with the Transport Secretary yesterday, Grant Shapps, was not about working in partnership with us in recognising the appraisal process that we've undertaken. In fact, it was bizarre to the extent that the Minister, the Transport Secretary in England was not aware of the Transport Corridor Study that we've already carried out. He wasn't aware of the fact that we've identified what the nature of the investment is required on a road like the A75. What he wanted to do was he wanted me to accept that the A75 should be our key priority, over and above any other road transport project in Scotland. Over and above the rest of me thankful A83, the A82, the A96, the A9, the A1, it had to be the A75. And you can't operate a system where you are quite literally being asked or being tried to be told that that should be your key priority going forward. It has to be balanced out across all of the other competing demands, not just in Scotland, but in the southwest, around rail investment, investment in the A77, in the A76, in the A75, in active travel. All of these have to be balanced out in order to make sure they reflect the feedback we received during the consultation process. And that's the process which will determine our investment, not the Union Connectivity Review, which I say is very superficial in its engagement, but it will be the STPR2 process. And there's a very significant amount of work already being carried out in South West Scotland, and that will help to inform the finalised STPR2 when it's published later this year.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for that response. In addition to what you've just described, there's some other process of a discrete piece of work that's going to be conducted to look at a fixed link between Britain and Northern Ireland. I'm just wondering how public money can be, followed, or if there is a discrete piece of work that's taken place. I mean, is that what the modus operandi is of the UK government, to do discrete pieces of work without engaging local, like communities, for instance? I know the people in Stranraer absolutely want to be consulted in anything going forward, but I'm not sure how that works out if there's discrete pieces of work that go ahead without engaging the people that are going to be directly impacted by any infrastructure investment.
Well, on this issue again, I had a discussion with Sir Peter Hendy yesterday afternoon, who's drafted this report and been commissioned by the Prime Minister to take it forward. I can't speak for Peter Hendy, but I get the distinct impression that whatever the feedback was around the idea of a bridge or a tunnel, is it had to be in the report, so one way or the other. I also discussed last night the issue of the Union Connectivity Review with my counterpart in Northern Ireland, Nicola Mellon, who's the Minister for Infrastructure in Northern Ireland, and she was absolutely of the same view as myself, is that the idea of a bridge or a tunnel or whatever of those two options is the feasibility study is going to be on, or if it's on both, is that it is not a priority for Northern Ireland. Given all the other infrastructure priorities that they have, like we have, is the idea of a bridge or tunnel to Northern Ireland is not a priority. And when you consider that in December last year, the Institute of Civil Engineers, who know a thing or two about building infrastructure projects of this nature, suggested that it could be between 40 to 50 billion pounds for this. In my view, the danger is that in trying to plough ahead with a project of this nature, is it will just suck financial resource away from other infrastructure projects, not just transport infrastructure projects, but also schools, hospitals, housing, because this has been given the priority. And that's the whole problem with the Union Connectivity Review. It's not about grounding decisions on the basis of what local need and assessment has been identified. It's on the basis of what has already been identified as what they see as the outcome they want, and that the report has been designed in such a way as to try and deliver on that in itself. So in my view, the bridge tunnel is nothing more than a vanity project. And I'll say again, as I've said previously, it won't happen in my lifetime, and I suspect it won't happen in the lifetime of anybody in the committee, with all due respect.
I've given everyone quite a lot of leeway, sorry, if I may, on this, and I'm deliberately trying to steer people away from going down political routes. But there are other questions, Emma, you wanted to ask, and I would ask people just to be mindful that of the difficulties that we have at the moment by conflagrating two things together. Emma.
Yep, thanks very much, Convener. I just wanted to have that opportunity while I had the Cabinet Secretary, but you're right, I've got a couple of other questions to ask. And in the debate yesterday, we talked about how 20% of car journeys, or there should be a reduction in distance driven by cars by 20% over 10 years. And Cabinet Secretary, how confident are you that we will be able to reduce this distance travelled by cars, these kilometres that we're talking about? And I guess, and my final question, I'll just roll it in in the issues of time, Convener, is looking at CO2 emissions from cars. So it's increased in the last 4 years in Scotland, despite the Scottish Government's support for ultra-low emission vehicles. So I'm curious, what action can the Scottish Government take to help reverse that trend? So thank you. Two questions.
Okay, thanks, Convener. I'll deal with both of those in turn. So the 20% target is a very ambitious target to achieve over a 10-year period, particularly given that transport is a derived demand. It's not something which can be delivered by the transport sector on its own. It will require a whole range of actions across different areas. A key part of that is going to be a need to make sure that we are able to make public transport as attractive a proposition as possible, to encourage people to make use of public transport, to encourage people to make use of active travel, particularly for those short local journeys where they can. So the investment we're making in public transport, things like bus prioritisation, active travel, are all critical to helping to support that mode shift from the use of cars, particularly, as I say, for short journeys. The other aspect that will be necessary here is for behaviour change. That behaviour change at the present moment could be aided by the pandemic in the way in which business practices have changed, so the way in which more people are working from home. So some businesses that had staff in the office 5 or 6 days a week may in the future decide only to have them in 2 or 3 days a week, and those who commuted by car would then reduce their car journeys. So it will require a change in behaviour alongside some of the incentives to encourage people to make greater use of active travel and public transport. And I want to emphasise the point that it's not something that the transport sector will be able to deliver on its own. It will require coordinated action across a number of areas. In relation to your second point around CO2 emissions, I think it'd be fair to say that the CO2 emissions in Scotland overall, in the course of the last 10 years, have seen a reduction overall. But any increase in any particular sector or element of a sector is always a matter of concern. A key part of challenging this is trying to help to support people to move to ultra-low emission vehicles. And we have a programme in place to help to support people to be able to move to electric and other ultra-low emission vehicles. That's a combination of not just supporting them in purchasing these vehicles, but also making sure we have the infrastructure in place to help to support people in being able to move to electric vehicles. And Scotland has now got the highest level of charging places per 100,000 of the population in any other part of the UK. And we already have plans in place to look at how we can reinforce that and develop it even further. So a combination of helping to support people in the transition to ultra-low emission vehicles and the infrastructure help to support them in making sure when they do so that they're able to charge their cars as conveniently as possible.
Thank you. The Deputy Convener, I think, wants to come in. So I'll bring Maureen in, and Emma, if you want to come in with a supplementary, I'm happy to bring you back in. Maureen first.
Thanks, Convener. In terms of the increase in vehicles, are you able to drill down to exactly what kind of vehicles they are? I mean, if people are staying at home and are getting deliveries rather than going out and shopping, has that helped to lead to the increase? And in terms of, not having control of vehicle taxation, which is still a reserved matter, how can we encourage people who don't need them to not buy SUVs when they're just in the centre of Edinburgh and Aberdeen and are not out in fields like the convener is with his? Sorry, Convener.
Thank you. I'm freely happy to admit that I haven't met a vehicle that can go off-road which isn't an SUV. But anyway, Cabinet Secretary.
Okay, well, I'm not going to get into a trading war over which vehicles folks should have, or whether it should be a Honda or a Toyota or a Land Rover. But what I'll say is that, although I'm personally a Honda fan, but what I would say is that on your wider point around types of vehicles, I'm going to ask Alison Irvine to come in here because she is our data guru around this matter. What we have saw over the course of the pandemic is quite an uptick in what you would describe as being possibly the local van deliveries taking place because of that increasing amount of people making use of online delivery systems, whether it be Amazon or whoever else in delivering goods, and also from shops. So we have saw an increase in the type of local delivery vans over the course of the pandemic. But before I bring Alison in, Convener, if you don't mind doing so, on the issue of tax incentives, I think there is a need for carrot and stick here to try and incentivise people to move towards greater use of ultra-low emission vehicles. We only have to look across the North Sea to Norway, and the way in which they've been successful in getting a very significant transition to the ultra-low emission vehicles, particularly electric vehicles, has been through tax incentives, through I think they don't apply VAT to their electric vehicles, which makes them significantly lower in cost compared to combustion engine vehicles. So I believe that there is a need to look at how we can use tax incentives as a means by which we encourage people to move towards ultra-low emission vehicles. But that is an area which is reserved. And my understanding, though, is I think the UK government are looking at that issue, but it's not clear yet exactly how they intend to go about doing that. But on the issue of data, Convener, if there's time, Alison Irvine might be able to give you a bit more in the way of hard data around some of the behaviour patterns that we've witnessed over the last the last 9 to 10 months.
Alison, over to you, succinctly, please.
Okay, I'm happy to do so. So as the Cabinet Secretary's outlined, what we have been monitoring travel demand over the course of the pandemic. We publish that on a weekly basis, very definitely related to whichever the restrictions are in place. From an emissions perspective, and particularly relating to cars, as the question related, what we're seeing overall is that there are less new cars being purchased, so therefore people are holding on to vehicles longer, and there'll be a myriad of reasons that lie behind that. So that will be a driving factor in determining the level of car emissions. What the pandemic has done in terms of what we would describe LGV emissions has actually accelerated a behaviour that we were already starting to see, which is that move from individual personal trips to retail parks, high streets, etc., with a move to that online delivery. So it's accelerated that kind of behaviour, which would be one reason why I would suggest that, moving forward, and in fact, I think this is one of the recommendations that came from the committee itself on the climate change plan, was that sort of continued focus on freight and the emissions that were coming from freight moving forward. I think as we've touched across various sort of questions and answers over the course of this session, we are in relatively deep uncertainty in terms of what the future might hold from a transport perspective. I think we're quite well sort of cited in terms of where some of the risks lie, both in terms of emissions, but also in terms of just overall achieving the National Transport Strategy priorities and outcomes. I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. Emma, you wanted to come in with a couple of, a brief supplementary.
Sure, Convener, thanks. It is just a wee sup. During COVID, we've seen more e-bikes and e-cargo bikes used, and I've raised this with the Cabinet Secretary in previous visits to the committee as well. But I'm assuming now that we've got 20-mile-an-hour zones that are popping up in loads of towns, including in Dumfries, that will increase safety by reducing the speed limit of cars. So I'm assuming that the government will be able to look at measurement of the use of e-cargo bikes and bikes in town centres and correlate that with the introduction of 20-mile-an-hour zones, which make it more safe.
Briefly,
yes, yeah. So there is a fund where third sector organisations can, and some businesses can, secure funding to purchase e-cargo bikes to assist them, particularly for carrying out local deliveries. So there is a funding mechanism that can be accessed for that. The use of 20-mile-an-hour zones is, from a local authority point of view, and the work that's been taken forward by Borders Council is a very good example of a local authority using its powers in order to introduce 20-mile-an-hour zones on a very localised basis that is specific to their area. That we want to use that experience in Borders to share it with other local authorities across Scotland, because they already have very extensive powers in this area. We've carried out some review work with local authorities around the use of 20-mile-an-hour zones. Some have strategies, some don't, some prioritise it, some don't, and we're now going to be taking forward some further work to help to support them in being able to deliver a more effective introduction of 20-mile-an-hour zones within their local areas. So the committee will be aware from our previous consideration of this. My view is that the decision making in 20-mile-an-hour zones is best taken at a local level to reflect the local circumstances, and we want to help to support that, and that's part of the work that we're taking forward. But all of that can help to support and encourage people to make greater use of active travel locally.
Okay, thanks, Cabinet Secretary. I think, John Finney, you want to come in briefly on this particular point as well. John.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, on that particular, and I note you're rightly trumpeting the approach taken by Borders Council. I wonder, do you see any irony in the resistance to my colleague Mark Ruskell's very sensible bill actually being focused around the position of Borders Council? Is there not a real irony in that? Welcome though the progress is, and welcome though that will result in less injuries and less deaths, but ironic?
No, I don't see it as ironic, and I, as I said at the time, I recognised what the intention was behind Mark Ruskell's bill, and there are many parts of it and what it was intending to do that I agree with. The problem was it was seeking to create a one-size-fits-all approach, which for some local authorities was highlighted as being inappropriate and it would not be effective. So the problem with trying to just apply a blanket legislative approach to it, and that basis, creates unintended consequences. So that's why the approach that we are taking is much more about making sure that local authorities take a strategic approach to their introduction at a local level. And it would be fair to say there are many local authorities that are doing that. So, for example, major local authorities like Glasgow City Council have set out their plans now and how they want to roll out the use of 20-mile-an-hour zones. So councils do have the powers and the capability to do that. What we are doing, though, is we're looking at what further measures we can put in place to help to support them in the introduction of 20-mile-an-hour zones within their areas, including some of the technical aspects of it and the financial aspects which are associated with it, but doing so on a basis that is reflective of the local circumstances and local decision-making being made by local councillors.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The next questions come from Angus MacDonald. Angus.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Turning to the Transport Scotland Act 2019, at our meeting on the 2nd of September last year, we asked you about progress with regard to developing secondary legislation on a range of transport matters, and you informed the committee that officials were working on these issues, but that no timescales for delivery were available at that time. So can I ask specifically, given that pedestrians are at the top of the sustainable transport hierarchy in the National Transport Strategy, can you explain what action the Scottish Government is taking to expedite the introduction of the ban on pavement and dropped kerb parking?
Cabinet Secretary.
Okay, good morning, Mr MacDonald. So you're correct. Back in September, that was the position, because officials had to move away from dealing with the introduction of the provisions within the Act to deal with matters relating to the pandemic, and towards the latter part of summer last year, we were able to start moving some staff back into dealing with issues relating to the Transport Act. We restarted that process, and specifically on the parking provisions, and there is currently a development programme on secondary legislation which aims to bring them into force. We introduced further commencement regulations in December of last year, which brings sections of the Act into force that will enable us to issue direction to local authorities, requiring them to support the associated guidance that will be necessary to undertake the assessment of streets and to identify streets where potential exemptions will be required for on-street parking. That process has already started. The commencement regulations have already been laid, and what we're now doing is that officials are now consulting with local authorities to develop the parking standard guidance, which will underpin the provisions within the Act itself. Also, early last month, we issued the latest draft of the chapters that will allow local authorities to undertake the assessment of their streets for their consideration, and also for them to provide us with feedback. And we're also presently consulting colleagues in local authorities with the exemption order process, which will be taken forward over the course of the next few months, with a view to making the regulations in this area by the end of the year. So we are making progress with that, and I hope we'll continue to make good progress with that over the coming months.
Okay, that's good to hear, Cabinet Secretary. I'm sure it'll be welcome not just by the committee, but also by our colleague Sandra White, who had a members' bill in the last term of Parliament, which was dropped just before the election. So it's good to hear of that progress. Sticking with the Transport Act, what do you expect the key bus-related provisions of the Transport Scotland Act, when do you expect the key bus-related provisions to enter into force, and when can passengers expect to see any service improvements flowing from these changes?
So the bus elements of it were impacted again, just in the same way with the parking provisions due to the pandemic. Work has already started now on the bus provisions within the Transport Act. There's a stakeholders workshop due to take place next week, which its primary purpose is to look at informing the public consultation exercise, which will be necessary around some of the regulations associated with this provision. And our intention is that consultation exercise should take place later this year, after the elections. In turn, once we've completed that consultation exercise around these provisions, we'll then be able to introduce the relevant secondary legislation to Parliament and to issue the guidance associated with it. So work has started. I'd expect the consultation completed in the months ahead, and once that's been completed, we'll then be able to look at the introduction of the secondary legislation, hopefully into Parliament later this year.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Okay, thanks very much, Angus. The next question is from Jamie Halcrow-Johnson. Jamie.
Thank you very much again, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, on the 10th of February, you told me in this committee that the Scottish Government remain committed to dueling the A9 and the timeframes that have been set out for that. You then wrote to me very helpfully to confirm that the 2025 date was, and I quote, very challenging target. And the First Minister told me last week that work was being done as quickly as possible, that the Scottish Government was working to the original target date if possible. And again, I quote, if that is not possible, we will do it as close to the original target date as possible. Not exactly encouraging. So given that you said a meaningful update won't be available until the summer and after the Scottish elections, could you confirm to me now, is work to dual the A9 on target, or is it behind projected timescales? If it is behind projected timescales, how far behind is it? Is it months or is it years? And do you expect the project still to be delivered within its £3 billion projected budget? And if not, what is the new projected cost?
So it is still on target, so a target of completing it by 2025 and also within the budget which was set for it. Significant progress has been made. You'll be aware of the announcement which I made just over a week ago for the section from Tomatin to Moy to progress to procurement, which will see the duelling of the most northern section of the A9. That's £115 million worth of investment in that particular section. And this morning I've announced that we are moving to complete the process of made orders for 4 further sections of the A9, which will allow us to progress the process of moving to procurement and the statutory process later on this year. That's very significant progress that is now being made. The pandemic has had some impact on the existing works, because you'll be aware that there was a closure of the construction works and construction during the course of the pandemic last year, which contractors are seeking to try and catch up. At the present moment, the contractors are still indicating that they expect that section to be complete by the winter of this year, which we hope, all going well, is the case. But the progress we're now making with the procurement of the most northern section, the moving to made orders for 4 further sections, and completing the statutory process in the remaining other sections later this year, will allow us to continue to make progress with the construction of the road. The one area where we are taking further work forward is around a piece of assessment work that we're doing with the construction sector between now and the summer of this year. Some of the construction companies have been impacted, obviously, by COVID, not just on projects that they're operating on at the present moment, but also in commitments to future projects. And the major projects team in Transport Scotland are engaging with a variety of commercial operators to just understand their capability and capacity to take on further major infrastructure projects over the next couple of years. And that process, once it's complete this summer, will give us a better line of sight around the capacity within the commercial sector to move on to undertaking further major works.
Thanks very much. Can I? Thanks, Kavina. Sorry, I know Maureen Watt's going to come on the A96, but I just wanted to ask on just further on the A9, how much, what percentage of the work that still has to be done? What is the percentage of the amount of work that still has to be done on that project by the 2025 completion date? Do you have an estimate on that? And then I might ask a question on the A82, Convener, if I've got time to.
So in terms of between the made orders programme that we've set out, the announcement that I've made today for 4 further areas, and also where the remaining public local inquiry reports, which we expect to get submitted for the next 3 schemes, which will complete that statutory element of the process as well. That would take us pretty close to 92% of the statutory process of the road, and the statutory process for 92% of it being complete. So the one remaining area is the area where we're taking it forward on a co-productive basis that involves local community being involved in the process, which is taking longer than was anticipated. But I would expect by later this year for us to be in a position where the statutory process has been by and large completed for some 92% of the whole route.
Okay, well, I think you're slightly more confident than I am. Can I just ask about the A82? Obviously, Scotland's deadliest road now. The Finance Secretary, Kate Forbes, who is the local MSP for the area, or currently the local MSP, has described it. It's definitely one of the most challenging roads in the country. Over the years, I've seen or heard about accidents, near misses, branches falling onto the road, tyre shredding potholes, convoys of slow-moving vehicles, lengthy delays and closures. Change must, can and will happen. When will that happen, Cabinet Secretary?
So Kate Forbes is a very effective representative for our constituents and regularly raises issues around the A82 on behalf of our constituents with officials in Transport Scotland and directly with myself. Provision for improvements to sections of the A82 is included within the second Strategic Transport Projects Review. So the STPR2 process is a gateway to taking forward the identified improvements that are required to the A82, as is the case with all other aspects of the truck road network in Scotland.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to the Deputy Convener now, Maureen Watt. Maureen.
Cabinet Secretary, my questions are similar to Jamie Halcrow-Johnson's, but in relation to the A96 dualling project, which is due for completion 5 years later than the A9 in 2030. But the recently published infrastructure investment plan states that only 20 million of the £3 billion project is due to be spent between 2021-22 and 25-26. Can you explain why that figure seems to be quite low? And also, can I ask, in terms of delays in infrastructure projects, how often is the delay due to protracted discussions on land purchase with landowners in and around the project? I mean, Inverramsey Bridge took forever because of protracted discussions with landowners over purchase, and I wondered whether more use could be made of compulsory purchase if delays are due to that. Thank you.
Okay, Convener, on the A96, so we remain committed to the original timeframe. The funding which you are referring to is the level of funding which is necessary to continue with the process of taking forward the planning, design and the statutory process that's necessary. Where with major infrastructure projects like roads, where you will see the ramping up of investment is when you start to move towards procurement. And because we are still some time back from some of the construction work for the A96, that's why you will see the level of funding that we have at the present moment. I'll ask Jo to say a wee bit more about that, given her expertise in this area. But what you also see in major infrastructure projects is that you will see a yo-yoing of funding within major infrastructure projects. Sometimes the funding increases and then it drops down, particularly as it goes through its statutory process and design process, and your time is very much spent on consultation, the legal costs associated with the design work and the planning for it, and the consultant's role, as opposed to the actual construction work. And then you'll see costs increasing again. But I'll ask Joe to say a little more on that. On your point around delay of in major infrastructure projects, what's often forgotten or missed in infrastructure projects is that, particularly when it comes to roads, is that there's a statutory process that has to be gone through, and that we don't control all elements of that. So at times that involves going to public local inquiry. It can then be challenged in courts when the made orders are issued around process, where it can be taken to the Court of Session. These issues can all add into the time frame. So although ministers can set out the target time frame for when they want a project to be completed by, there are elements of the process that we legally fill that can have an impact on the final delivery time frame, and that can be quite significant. A very good example of that is, of course, AWPR, which was delayed by a number of years as a result of legal challenge around some of the order making process. So it can have a significant impact on it. It's frustrating, but it's also important that when we get to the point of looking at using compulsory powers, that we are fulfilling our legal obligations, and that those who are affected by it have their legal rights protected and considered as well. But I'll ask Joe maybe to say a little, convener, if there's time, just around the seesaw you can get around funding of major projects.
Yes, Joe, again, you can definitely contribute. Just if you could do it succinctly, it would help me.
Okay, thank you, convener. Just to reflect what the Cabinet Secretary said, that one of the things that's very difficult, I think, for everyone to understand is that behind the scenes there are hundreds of people working on these programmes often. So for something the scale of the A96 or the A9, when we start off and we're trying to set direction and engage with stakeholders and put all the pieces together, we will have substantial sized teams working on that stuff, and that is what builds the evidence that then helps support the CPO case further on. So it becomes very important that we've got broad multidisciplinary teams looking at all those aspects. What then happens is, as we move into the statutory process, we are effectively defending that position, and the team naturally contracts to a smaller group of specialists that we will then work together to build the case to take through that compulsory purchase process. So there is a general sort of contracting, and then obviously we move into the procurement and the construction stage, and the nature of the workforce changes again, but the teams will then expand again. So it is a kind of moving feast, if you like.
Thank you very much, Joe. Maureen, do you want to come back on that, or are you satisfied?
Fine, thank you, convener.
Okay, thank you. The next question then comes from John Finney. John.
Thank you, convener. And Cabinet Secretary, I have a question about the rest and be thankful, but before I do, I would like to put on record my thanks and thanks of constituents to the hard work of the workforce at that site. It's a very demanding location. Weather is very difficult. But can I ask you if you could provide, please, an overview of the Access to Argyll project, including how the Scottish Government intends to maintain continuity of travel on the route whilst a permanent solution is developed, please?
Okay. Yes, I'm happy to do that, convener. And can I associate myself with the comments that John Finney's made around the staff have been working on the rest and be thankful, particularly in recent months where they've experienced some very significant challenges, for which I'm extremely grateful. Although disappointed I can't actually go and meet them in person to thank them, but I hope to be able to do that when it's safe to do so. The Access to Argyll project is now at the point where we have completed a consultation on the 11 different options that we set out, and I hope by the course of the next couple of weeks before the recess to set out the preferred corridor that has been identified through the consultation exercise. That will then draw down to the specific options within that particular corridor for delivering a permanent long-term solution to the challenges that we have on the 83 at the Resting Be Thankful. What I've also asked officials in Transport Scotland to do is to consider how they can compress the time frame for the completion of the project. And I know that there's anxiety locally about how long major projects of this nature can take. So I have asked them specifically to look at ways in which we can compress the time frame as much as possible, while also meeting our legal obligations to deal with the statutory elements that may be involved in it if compulsory purchases, etc., are involved in taking ownership of land, which I can't avoid and may be necessary. So so that's where we are with the travel corridor process, and as I say, I hope to set that out in the next couple of weeks. The third element, convener, is that we are continuing our mitigation work, both on the hillside on A83 at Glencroe and also on the OMR road as well, to look at whether there's further mitigations we can put in place, some of which is already happening on the hillside and also the roadside, in order to provide greater resilience on both the old military road and on the A83 itself. And that financial commitment continues going forward. So I want to protect what we've got, while at the same time setting out a very clear direction for the future, and to look at how we can compress the time frame as much as possible to deliver a new access route into Argyll, and one which is much more reliable than the people of Argyll are getting at the present time, with the Resting Be Thankful, that simply is not acceptable in my estimations.
John.
Thank you, Cabinet. Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, I appreciate the challenges, and I know that everyone has public safety at the forefront of their deliberations. Are you in any way able to give any sort of time frame? Of course, what everyone wants is a sustainable permanent solution, but best case scenario, when might that be, please?
I'm hesitant to use timeframes, Mr. Finney, not because I wish to be evasive, but I know that if I set a time frame, folk will just say, well, that's when it's going to be delivered by. And there are a whole range of things that I don't control, including the statutory process that could have implications here as well. But what I can say to you is that I have made it very clear to my officials in Transport Scotland, and they recognise this, is that they should be looking at this project as, in effect, an emergency project, one that requires to be taken forward at rapid speed. And I've asked them to have a mindset that looks at it as an emergency, as opposed to it being a normal major infrastructure project. And they are looking to take it forward. So, for example, they're already looking at some of the work that will be necessary on the various options around the route that we choose once we've identified the corridor, and some of the pros and cons of those options, and also what can we do in advance to try and progress some of this as quickly as possible. So don't want to be evasive, as I said, but I can assure you officials recognise that we need to deal with this on an emergency basis, and that's the way in which the team and the process has been set up.
Many thanks. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, John. The next question then is from Richard Lyle. Richard.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, numerous members have asked you about roads this morning, so I think I will mention a couple too. You mentioned the M8 corridor, excellent. Noise reduction fencing all along the sections of the routes, but you come to the M74, trees destroyed, construction of it, when we constructed an extra lane, noise levels severely increased, no noise fencing, and we've replanted tree twigs and small bushes. I have a constituent who I've written to you on numerous occasions, who I believe has now written to you in regard to trying to sell a house due to the noise, but can't because of the noise. Can you tell me when the fencing or anything will be done on the M74?
Right, Mr. Lyle.
Everybody else has asked in their areas, so I'm asking too.
Mr. Lyle, I will of course let the Cabinet Secretary answer your question, but I really do urge you. This is about national policy rather than constituent questions.
Other people have asked.
Mr. Lau, with the greatest respect, let's not fall out over it. Answer the question, please, Cabinet Secretary, briefly, and then move on to what you were going to ask on, Mr. Lau, and then you and I will remain able to work together. Thank you.
Other people have deviated from their questions.
Mr. Lyle.
So I think, Convener, the best thing for me to do here would be to write to Mr. Lyle specifically on the matter. I know it's an important issue for his constituents, and he's pursued this issue for them very diligently over the last couple of years. And I responded to the issue in the Chamber fairly recently. But what I'll do is I'll write to Mr. Lyle directly with further information specifically for his constituent.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, for steering a line through the middle. And Mr. Lyle, back to your question.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that reply? Cabinet Secretary, as you also know, I have been astute in defending Glasgow Prestwick Airport and suggesting it's the jewel in the crown and think that it should be used more. The Scottish Government had hoped to sell Glasgow Prestwick Airport to a private sector bidder during 2020. I believe negotiations between the airport management and an unnamed preferred bidder had been underway. However, this sale fell through and the airport again was put up for sale on the 5th of November. You wrote to the committee on the 23rd of February 2021 advising that the Scottish Government had accepted a recommendation made by TS Prestwick Holdco to appoint a preferred bidder. Can you provide an update on the potential sale of Glasgow Prestwick Airport, as again I think it's one of the an airport which is underused and is now well connected by new roads that have been constructed through that area?
So, as you referred to, Mr. Lyle, I wrote to the committee to advise that the management team at Prestwick Airport had identified a preferred bidder and recommended that to Scottish ministers. We accepted that recommendation. The sales negotiation diligence process is presently ongoing. Therefore, I'm unable to say much more because I have to respect the integrity and the confidentiality of the sales process. But my understanding is that good progress is continuing to be made. And you correctly point out the importance of that aviation facility to not just the local economy, but the regional economy and the Scottish economy as a whole, given the number of aerospace jobs which are associated with the airport. And I will endeavour to keep the committee informed as progress moves forward over the next couple of months.
Well, as you did say, Cabinet Secretary, it's an important airport to many people in that area, and I thank you and I wish you well. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr. Lyle. Next question on this subject is from Mike Rumbles. Mike.
Thank you, Convener. Just following on from Richard Lyle's question, of course, it is a national issue, this, certainly not a regional issue for the North East of Scotland. So what I would like to know from the Cabinet Secretary is, what is the first, I've got two questions. My first question is, what is the current plan, regardless of selling the airport, what is the current plan for the return of £43.4 million in loans that the Scottish Government have given of taxpayers' money to the management company? So what's the current plan for the repayment of that money to the Scottish Government?
So if the airport is not sold, it's a loan which remains on the books of Prestwick Airport as an operating company and is on commercial terms and will have to be repaid to the Scottish Government. How they repay that will be largely dependent upon the commercial income that they receive as an airport and the success that it has as an airport. So if the airport's got sold, then the operating company will have to repay that loan.
Well, that's very helpful because it does take me on to the second part of my question. And you've just said that if the airport is sold, then that money will have to come back to the Scottish Government because it's taxpayers' money in that loan. Just like any other commercial enterprise, if you lend money, you expect it to be repaid. It's interesting that there isn't from what your reply to my question is, that there isn't a plan to repay it, just a commitment to repay it to the Scottish Government. Taking what you've said in the response to that, can we safely assume that public money expended is safe in your hands, if I can put it that way? I'm sure you'd like to confirm that if the airport is sold, at that point the money will come back to the Scottish Government, part of the commercial deal?
So what I said was that if the airport is not sold, then the debt of that loan remains with the operating company at Prestwick Airport and would have to be repaid to the Scottish Government. But you'll recognise the reason why they have those loans, and the reason they have those loans is on the basis of the commercial challenges which they've faced. And had the Scottish Government not made that funding available, the likelihood is that the airport would have closed. And the jobs which are associated both directly and indirectly with the airport would have been likely to have been lost. Well, some would have been lost directly, and then many of the indirect jobs would have been put at significant risk. So the funding which has been made available by the Scottish Government is about sustaining the facility overall, given its importance to the local economy and to the wider aerospace industry which it supports. The negotiations which are taking place just now between the management team and the preferred bidder will obviously explore all of these issues, and we'll have to wait to see what the outcome of that negotiation is. What I'm not going to do is I'm not going to preempt any sales process and any negotiations that are taking place at the present moment.
You know, I understand that entirely, and my question isn't based on the fact that the loans were given. I understand and accept and agree with what you've said about the loans being given for the sustainability of the airport, okay. But when you gave that loan, when the Scottish Government gave that loan, there is an expectation, as you confirmed to answer my first question, that that loan is repaid. And you said that it should be repaid if the airport is sold. Now, I'm not asking anything about the negotiations. Sorry?
That's not what I said.
I misunderstood.
Yeah, you have. So I said to you that if Prestwick is not sold, then the loan remains with the operating company, and it would have to be repaid at some point, because it's a loan that's been provided in commercial terms to the operating company. So for the reasons which I've outlined, if the airport is sold, then issues around the loan will be part of the negotiation process and any sales process, which the operating company has to take forward.
Thank you for clearing that up, because I was very happy with what I thought was your first reply. I'm not so happy with the reply that you just mentioned, because in any commercial operation, if you're transferring assets from a company to another company, they would normally take on those liabilities, as the Scottish Government took on the liabilities for Prestwick when it bought it for £1. So my question again is a very simple one. I'm not asking you about any of the negotiations with this particular bidder. I'm asking you in general terms, if the government has, because the government has issued this £43.4 million loan to this company, is it your expectation that that money will be returned to the Scottish Government? Because I'm concerned that we have to be vigilant to make sure that we are proper guardians of taxpayers' money, because it isn't actually the Scottish Government's money, it's taxpayers' money. And surely, if you are transferring the liability from one company to another, an ownership, one body to a new company, then you would expect, and surely we would expect, that the Scottish Government gets that money repaid to it. I don't mean it at once, but with a commitment to repay it to the taxpayer.
So I understand the point you're making, although you are asking me to give an insight into the negotiation process with the existing preferred bidder, and I'm not prepared to do that. What I can say to you is that the management team at Prestwick are pursuing the best possible deal, both for those who work directly at the airport and also for those businesses that are dependent upon the airport, and also for taxpayers. And what we'll need to do is to wait to see what the outcome of that negotiation process is. But it's one that I think we should allow the space to be taken forward. And when we get to the point, if any sale is finalised, then I will be able to set out exactly what the financial implications of it are for Scottish taxpayers and what any sale has gone through and what it means for both staff and businesses that are linked to the airport.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Convener, I think I've exhausted my line of questioning to the Cabinet Secretary, and he's dealt with it. I'm sure he's very happy the way he's dealt with my line of questioning. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike. And Cabinet Secretary, as these are figures and I enjoy figures, I thought I'd ask you a few questions myself on this. Could you confirm that the period April 20 to March 21, Prestwick Airport required no subsidies from the Scottish Government?
I don't have those figures in front of me, Convener, but I'd be more than happy to come back to the committee with the details on that.
Well, you did confirm to me that in the budget negotiations, there was no money allocated to Prestwick Airport. That was probably, Cabinet Secretary, because at the 31st of March, Prestwick Airport was sitting on £14.3 million worth of cash at their bank, according to their figures. So on the basis that at the end of that year, March 2020, why did you feel it was necessary to give them a loan of £3.5 million just prior to that period when they had so much cash at the end of the year?
Again, I don't have those figures specifically in front of me, but I'd be more than happy to check and come back to the committee with it. But you're right, as I confirmed during their budget discussion, is that there is no provision for providing financial support to Prestwick Airport for this coming financial year on the basis of where the management team are in being able to commercialise different aspects of the business. So, but your specific figure around the £3 million, I don't have that before me, but I'm more than happy to get that checked and come back to you.
Well, it makes me slightly concerned that at the end of the financial year, 31st of March 20, you know, we bumped up their figures to 14.3 million by giving them a loan, which they clearly didn't need. So I question that. And when you write back to me, that would be helpful. But that £14 million, part of that came from the radar mitigation and sales of property, about £7.4 million, which are non-recurring income, and also from the heavy use of the airport by military aircraft from the US, Canada and Kuwait. So could you just confirm to me that, you know, if you'd taken out, or on the basis if you take out the sales and the mitigation and the reduction in military aircraft which has occurred, that the airport is not going to draw down on the money that they'd got at the end of March 2020, because it doesn't appear to me they're making money, which is what you've claimed they are. It appears they're using their reserves to fund their continued operation.
Well, they are using some of the reserves which they have to continue the operation at Prestwick, some of which they've achieved through non-recurring sales. So some of which involves, as you mentioned, the radar mitigation elements of it. So, so there are alongside that, they have also increased the level of funding which they've secured through the provision of refuelling at Prestwick in recent years, which has been a significant factor in helping to improve their balance sheet overall. So, so I think it'd be wrong to say that they have not improved their financial position, or to give the impression they haven't improved their financial position. But look, we're now in a position where the airport has a preferred bidder with a view to potentially purchasing the airport, and we'll now wait and see what the outcome of that negotiation process is. Okay, well, I'm not sure that answers the question, but just pushing one, my last question is an interesting, it's a follow-on to Mike Rumbles' question of the £43.4 million that have been loaned to the airport. And I want to be entirely clear that I think the airport is really important, it succeeds, but you have excluded
in that, any interest due on those payments. If you look at the accounts and the accruals and deferred income, that has risen. So it would suggest to me that there may be £5.2 million worth of interest that are due on the loans. And I was wanting that confirmation that that money, the loaned money and the interest on it, specifically the interest in it, will be coming back to the taxpayer.
So I'm always interested, Convener, in those who qualify their challenge around the loans that have been given to Prestwick Airport by saying that they support and recognise the importance that the airport plays both to the regional and national economy. But had those loans not been provided, the facility would be closed. It wouldn't be there, and the jobs directly associated with it and those businesses that are dependent upon it would have had a significant financial impact and also employment impact as a result of not making that funding available to them. I think if I recall correctly, you raised this point with me previously, and Francis Passetti agreed to come back to the committee, and if I recall correctly, you were provided with information on that around whether the interest levels were included within that figure. And if I recall correctly, that information was provided to the committee. Is that incorrect? Was that not provided? Because if not, I'll make sure that it is.
Well, I'm delighted if you will provide it. I look at the latest accounts, and it's some time since Ms. Pancetti came and gave evidence to the committee, and I'm trying to look at the accruals and deferred income and how that increase has gone up to work out exactly how much has been put in. And please don't conflagate the fact that money is put forward to support businesses. It's important that money is put forward to support businesses. What I'm just seeing, and I'm wanting to understand that it's been done wisely, and that's what I'm checking. So it's unfair to do anything. So I guess, as you don't have the figures, we will have to wait for the answers, which no doubt will come before the PERDA period. And I move to my next set of questions, which are from Peter Chapman. Peter.
Thanks, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, my questions are regarding the Queensferry crossing and the issue of closure of the bridge due to ice on the cables. Now, we know that BEAR Scotland tested an emergency diversion onto the old bridge in December last year and again in January of this year. So my question is, what did you learn from that process? How quickly can this diversion be put in place when necessary? And is this now to be the preferred option when ice on the cables is an issue going forward?
So, good morning. The operational management of incidents on the bridge continues to be the main way in which they'll deal with any issues, including issues relating to ice build-up on the towers or the cables. The learning from the diversion onto the Forth Road Bridge has identified a number of operational issues that they need to have in place in order to minimise the time frame for a diversion onto the Forth Road Bridge. That includes pre-deployment of traffic management equipment and also making sure that there's early communication of the plan being put into place. Time frame for introducing the diversion is approximately 5 hours. So from the decision point through to making the diversion, it takes around a 5-hour period. So what would happen is that in deciding to divert onto the Forth Road Bridge, is that in the short term, the Kincardine Bridge would be used as the principal diversion route until the diversion onto the Forth Road Bridge has been completed. Which, as I say, would take around 5 hours to do so. However, in taking it forward, the learning I understand from BEAR Scotland was that it went well. However, one of the factors that could have an impact on switching over to the Forth Road Bridge could be that of adverse weather. So adverse weather may have an impact on them being able to actually take forward the traffic management arrangements, as you can imagine, just the practicality of doing that. So so they're still working through some of those details. But in practice, Mr. Chapman, it takes around from the two events, it takes around 5 hours for that diversion to be operational.
So from that answer, I take it that is the preferred option if the weather is suitable. Of course, if you've got high winds, the Old Forth Bridge had to close because of high winds previously, and we know that. So what about a technical solution to the issue of the ice? I mean, we believe that there's ongoing discussions to find another way to alleviate the ice on the cable. So, what are the parameters of this project, expected timescales and costs for the project? And, is it a practical way forward? Can it be done? Is probably the main asked question on the ice.
So I think your latter point is a fair comment, because it's a problem which is associated with other cable stay bridges across the world. So it's a problem that is experienced in other parts of the world with cable stay bridges, and the principal way in which they are managed from the research that's been carried out is through operational changes which are made, where it's diverting routes or using one carriageway, etc. So the principal way that the sector across the world appears to be dealing with these matters is through operational arrangements. In our case, that would be switching on to the Forth Road Bridge for that purpose. The good thing is that the Queensferry crossing is a much more resilient crossing than the Forth Road Bridge. So the number of occasions when the Queensferry crossing has still been operational and open to high-sided vehicles compared to what we had with the Forth Road Bridge it's night and day. It's been transformational in terms of giving us much greater resilience there. But we have had a couple of occasions, obviously, where this ice accretions has resulted in the bridge having to be closed. So the research that's been taken forward is looking at a number of different issues, Mr. Chapman. It's looking at the possibility of hydrophobic coating on the cables. It's also looking at a different type of de-icing system that could potentially be deployed. And the intention is that some of that will be, some laboratory research will be carried out later this year to test out these options. And then potentially, if they indicate that they could be helpful, there is a possibility that we may be able to deploy a couple of pilots for next winter in trying out a couple of these options as a long-term solution. So, the research, the lab testing, and then some of the pilots, research has been completed, identified potential options from lab testing, and then potentially some piloting of options for next winter before looking at wider potential deployment of it on the structure. So I hope that gives you a reassurance of the very serious way in which we are dealing with this matter, in order to see if we can identify a long-term solution to this occasional issue that arises with ice gathering on the towers and on the cables.
And if I may, Convener, just one final small question. Cabinet Secretary, when the traffic is diverted, obviously there's a huge increase in the volume of traffic going across the old bridge. Are we content that the old bridge is robust enough to deal with that? Because at the moment it's very light traffic on it. If you divert everything, of course, on a busy Friday morning, the bridge is full of traffic. I mean, is there any concern that wear and tear on the old bridge is going to be significant?
So it's a fair point, because one of the criticisms which I faced, which Transport Scotland has faced, is that following the closure last year for a couple of days, why wasn't the Forth Road Bridge opened up? And the reason for that is because the Forth Road Bridge was actually undergoing its major refurbishment programme. So to make sure that it is safe and fit for use. So that work has been, by and large, we completed most of it. Some of it was suspended during the winter to allow us to be able to move on to it if necessary. But most of that work has now been completed. So the Forth Road Bridge is up to its expected standard and is safe for use for the traffic volumes that would make use of it. and it's in a better shape now as a result of the refurbishment work which is being taken forward on the decking sections of it, which required to be replaced. So that work has now been completed. But it's in if it offers you reassurance if you're crossing at Mr. Chapman, is that it is in good shape.
Okay, thank you, convener. That's me.
Thank you very much. And that actually brings us to the end of this part of the committee meeting. So I'd like to thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and your officials for attending and taking part in the evidence session today. I'm now going to suspend the meeting till 11:55 to allow the next panel of witnesses to come on board. Thank you. Good morning again, and welcome back to our committee meeting for the second item on the agenda, which is the consideration of subordinate legislation. There is one affirmative instrument as detailed on the agenda. The committee will take evidence on the Plant Health EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2021. The motion seeking the approval of this affirmative instrument will be considered at item 3. I'd like to welcome from the Scottish Government Ben Macpherson, the Minister for Rural Affairs and the Natural Environment, Debbie Kessel, the Branch Head of Plant Health Policy, and Rachel Coots, who is a lawyer for the Scottish Government. Minister, I'd ask you to make a brief opening statement on the Plant Health EU Scotland Amendment Regulations 2021. Minister.
Good morning, Convener, and thank you to you and the committee for making time today to consider the draft SSI, the Plant Health EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2021. The regulations are being made to amend Scottish legislation in the field of plant health, in particular relating to charges for inspections of certain plant products, timber and timber product consignments. For imports, it is necessary for consignments from EU member states, Liechtenstein and Switzerland to now be charged fees according to the level of plant biosecurity risk posed to Scotland. These charges are now aligned with charges from non-European third countries. For exports, provision is introduced to remove the fee paid for phytosanitary certificates on consignments of timber and timber products leaving Scotland for Northern Ireland, and this serves to support the sector. In addition, offences are being created in relation to consignments from Northern Ireland entering Scotland. This is in relation to the type of plant passport, health certificate the consignments must hold. This supports compliance with plant health rules, therefore protecting Scotland's plant biosecurity. Northern Ireland traders are familiar with the plant passport system. These regulations are therefore necessary and appropriate, and my officials and I would be happy to take any questions from the committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And there are some questions from, first of all, from the Deputy Convener, Maureen Watt. Maureen.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Clearly, under Brexit, the seed potato industry was completely thrown under the bus. I noticed that on the list of plants and things, potato tubers are mentioned. Is there anything through any way that this legislation can be used to help the very lucrative and very important potato seed export industry from Scotland to not only the EU but the rest of the world?
Thank you, Maureen Watt, for that question. The subject of the very concerning situation for the seed potato industry has been a matter of attention that both myself and particularly the Cabinet Secretary Fergus Ewing have been engaged in since the Brexit deal in late December. There has been extensive dialogue with both the industry, UK government and the European Commission on behalf of seed potato farmers in order to help them with their situation and to promote their interests. With regard to the legislation before us, the legislation before us is in relation to the deal with the European Union as was agreed. So it's an implementation process. There aren't any definitive means, as far as I'm aware, in which this legislation would be supportive of the situation for seed potato farmers. But the attention of the government working with others to try and bring about a better scenario for seed potato farmers still remains an issue of priority. I would be grateful if Debbie could also come in at this point and just elaborate any further on those issues.
Minister, I'm very happy to let her come in. I'm sure if the members have read their papers, which they all have, with us, Tubers of potatoes are particularly excluded from this under Schedule 2 of the amendment on page 6 of the papers that were provided. But I'm very happy if you'd like further confirmation of that. And having made that comment, I ought to remind members that I have an interest in a farming partnership in Murray, which I didn't declare because there was nothing to do with agricultural products as far as I could see. But
I mentioned on page 9, convener.
Having been excluded on page 6. Okay, perhaps, who did you want to bring in? Debbie?
Please, yes.
Hi there, thank you. Thanks. Yes, as the Minister mentioned, this is just regarding fees. Our concern around seed potatoes is the export of them to the EU and to Northern Ireland. So this unfortunately doesn't allow us to help that situation at all.
Okay, so on fees. Any other? Emma Harper, you have a question.
Yep, thanks, convener. Just waiting on my camera coming on. Thank you. It's in relation to the fees and the inspections. My concern would be around where would we put the inspectors? Would they be in Cairnryan as part of a Port Harbour Health Inspection Authority? Are we really concerned about any risks to the phytosanitary products coming into Scotland? Because obviously it is a concern. So the fees in relation to this SSI, would they need to make sure that we had appropriate numbers of inspectors in place at specific port authorities, including the likes of Cairnryan, for instance?
So just for clarity, the inspections that are being undertaken, the inspections that this legislation brings the fees in for are already being undertaken. So there's a system already in place here, and this is all about biosecurity. That is the absolute focus of both the inspections, but also the reason that the provision that we're bringing in at this point is necessary is in order to make sure that we're feeing as appropriate to cover the cost of inspections. There has always obviously been an impact on the amount of considerations in terms of the border more generally, in terms of imports and exports as a result of the Brexit process. But the inspections are already in place, and this legislation before us today is simply about making sure that there is appropriate feeing in order to make sure that costs are covered.
Thank you, Minister. Is that right, Emma? Did you get your answer?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you, convener.
Thank you. There doesn't appear to be any more questions, so we'll now move on to the formal consideration of the motion related to this instrument. So the third agenda item is consideration of motion S5M 24145 that the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee recommends that the Plant Health EU Exit Scotland Amendment Regulations 2021 be approved. Minister, I would ask you to move the motion and ask if you have any further comments to make.
No further comments and formally moved, convener.
Thank you, Minister. Does any committee member have any comments they wish to make? There are no comments. So the question is that motion S5M 24145 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Just put an N in the box if we're not. We are all agreed, and therefore that concludes our consideration of this SSI. I'd like to thank you, Minister, and your officials for your time. The next meeting of the committee will be on Wednesday, the 17th of March, where we'll have the Minister for Energy, Connectivity and the Islands giving us a digital connectivity update. There will be 3 SSIs, 3 SIs, possibly with more to come. There'll be discussion of our legacy paper and our annual report. But that concludes our committee business today, and I'd like to thank you all for your attendance. Thank you. And I now close the meeting.